Hi everyone. This is our first lesson for the Crops 1 course, Greenhouse Crops 1. And this course is structured in such a way that myself, Derek, will be doing your lessons. And then when you go to the campus, Matt or will be running your greenhouse work. And the labs are set up basically for you to help him finish the crops that are in there. So there's a bunch of crops that are earmarked for you guys to do the work on. So I think right now it's poinsettia time. So he's got stuff planned for you guys to get the poinsettias trimmed and set up for Christmas. Whether they happen this first week or your second week, I'm not sure yet. I have to look at the crop. But next week's lesson is all about poinsettias. Today, I'm just doing another industry summary introduction type lesson. Another thing I should mention is any of these slides, if you see that the font has an underline, that means that it's a hyperlink and will go to a website that would be of interest. Now, in this YouTube version, it's difficult for me to do that. I can try, but I always upload the PowerPoint slides as well. So those links work for sure in that, if you follow along with PowerPoint or go through the slides again after. All right, so what is the industry, the state of the floriculture? And I'm going to add vegetables in here. Uh, so as far as the flower and potted flower industry goes, Ontario represents about 52% of Canada's production. BC comes in second, although they are shifting more to vegetables. Uh, and then as far as North America, we are third only after California and Florida in terms of producing. Now, there's a lot of companies in Florida that bring in or import, and we're ignoring that. This is about farm gate production. So that means that the Ontario industry represents about 30% of potted plants and cut flowers in the United States. My own personal growing experience from my greenhouse, I was a flower potted plant producer, and I shipped to companies like Home Depot in and Lowe's in Canada and US, and I also shipped to Wegmans and a bunch of other chains that are serviced through wholesalers in the Niagara area. But my own business was primarily domestic, so I sold just about everything I had went to Loblaws banner, which was Loblaws, Fortinos, your independent grocer, no frills, that kind of stuff. So that was our main venue for getting rid of our product. But anyways, the floriculture industry is present, it's strong. Um, but as looking at the stats, there's 680 growers in 2015 in Canada, which grew 450 hectares, so that's 1,112 acres. But vegetable growers are actually beginning to increase substantially. They have seen 10% or 25% increases in production capacity year over year for the last 10 years. And whereas floriculture has somewhat decreased. I mean, look at myself. I'm probably a classic example. I sold my farm. I looked at my market as shrinking and margins shrinking and thought, someone wants to buy my farm. I'm better off selling that now than operating, and unless I have to, or I would have to increase the size of the greenhouse substantially to offset the reduced margins. So anyways, that's my own personal story of it. But as far as vegetables go, this is the real interesting sector as far as I'm concerned for you guys as graduates. Looking at the 2019 numbers that are now posted, tomatoes, the crop represented $376 million, cucumbers 339 million, and peppers 301 and change million dollars. So the hydroponic vegetable sector is massive. It dwarfs the ornamental sector, and it is in really desperate for skilled growers. So there are lots of opportunities. Um, I don't want to leave out mushrooms. A lot of times people forget about mushrooms and they fall into horticulture And I only do one in-depth lesson on mushroom production because we don't have facilities here, but I give you enough, and there's enough parallels with growing plants that it's actually really not that difficult to sidestep into the industry. And there are a large number of big mushroom producing facilities in Ontario and Quebec that are looking for growers, and they will train you, and they'll be especially happy if you're coming out with a horticultural diploma that has some education in the production of mushrooms. So excellent job opportunities there. Of course, you may not be able to work on your suntan. Anyways, it is actually an interesting crop to grow, but yes, darkness and humidity might deter some people. In your PowerPoint slides, these are links to Excel sheets with current sales numbers, and there's all kinds of details if anyone out there is a numbers person and wants to dissect that. There is, in the greenhouse industry, there has in the last 10 years been what we call consolidation. That's where small companies are purchased or merged with larger companies, so they become larger entities. And it's not so much that it's predatory, it's more that the consumer base has shifted to mass market. A lot of people shop at places like Costco or Loblaws or Fortinos or whatever. And these chain stores demand consistency and they demand capacity. And so by farms merging together, or as we say, consolidating, they're more likely to be able to consistently supply quality product to those customers and keep them happy, which is absolutely critical, or they're going to look for someone else. So that being said, the industry is definitely on the upswing, and there is, like I said, tremendous growth. As far as average size greenhouses in the ornamental world, average size of a greenhouse is 43,000 square feet, where the average size for a vegetable greenhouse, that's actually incorrect. That should be 1.7 million square feet. But you get the sense that they're significantly larger. There are greenhouses, of course, all over Canada and specifically Ontario that are smaller, and the average size is around 1,500 square feet. These smaller greenhouses might serve local markets, maybe work with some wholesalers, but they often do some sort of direct retail from the garden center. Now, most of these garden center or small greenhouses don't have the revenues to hire someone full time. So this might be more along the lines, some of you might be interested or have the ability to start your own business. That is certainly a viable option. And with local produce and local being something that consumers demand, that certainly is an excellent opportunity. I would, for anyone who is interested in that, anytime someone has business ideas, I'm happy to talk and brainstorm. And in the past, I've helped students. Some have been successful, some have not, but sometimes, you know, you gotta try something, right? We have a student who graduated a number of years ago now, maybe 8 years ago, and she started a couple of hoop houses. She bought some cheap land up north, and she started growing various herbs that she could make into tea. And she bought a machine that would make tea pouches, and she started a company selling tea. And she's done very well for herself. So there are success stories. It can be done. As they always, you know, if you've ever watched the Pixar movies, the phrase is actually very true. If you see a need, fill a need, right? So just keep your eyes open. You see someone says, hey, it would be really nice if we could get that. And then you start digging and you realize that there's a market. Then you say, hey, I'm going to do this. And too many times people fail by saying, I like growing this, I'm going to grow this, and I'm going to make money. Well, they have to see if there's a market, right? That's the key. As far as the greenhouse goes, there's a number of challenges. Now, this is going to sound like, oh, there's so many challenges, but any kind of business is complex, and there are challenges. So don't think of this as negative. Just think of this. These are the things, the boxes that need to be ticked. These are the things that you have to overcome to be successful. It takes effort and energy. So things like export sales, marketing, how do we market, or crop protection, how to prevent disease. And then if you're exporting, there's issues like your currency value and things like borders closing, just like COVID-19. So we'll look at some of that stuff. As far as export sales, in recent years, there has been somewhat of a reduction in sales to the U.S., and ornamental growers in particular have refocused to Canadian markets. The vegetable sector is still shipping very heavily to the U.S. It's actually, that's something that kind of disturbs me but it's not the farmers' fault. Farmers just go where they can make money, right? And it seems a shame that they can make more money loading up transport trucks and shipping them to Texas than they can driving just a short distance down the highway to a local store. That has been somewhat slowly changing, but I'll be honest, it has more to do, and if you talk to the farmers, it has more to do with Canadian consumers. Canadian consumers are a very different beast than an American consumer. American consumers are less cost conscious. They're driven more by impulse and presentation, where Canadians are much more cost conscious and unfortunately less caring of the country of origin, which is sort of opposite to what we think, because in the media they talk about local, but and there are definitely communities where local is important, but on the big picture, we're dealing with limited funds, and so the consumers typically are cheap. Canadian consumers are cheap. I don't know how else to say it. Someone's going to be offended, but yeah, talk to your grocery store and find out. I always go through the produce section. I look at the country of origin, Chile, Mexico, California, whatever, or US. Sometimes you see Canadian stuff, and that's great. I snatch it up if I can, but it often is more expensive. So anyways, our quality produce goes to the States, is what I'm trying to say, and lower quality stuff stays in Canada. If you go down and work in the sectors, you'll see that firsthand. Potted plant sales in particular have really, the sales have sort of declined in the States. And that is not so much that, we're less competitive, or typically Canadian produce or potted plants are excellent quality. It has a lot more to do with consumer shifting. People are less interested in buying potted plants and flowers. They're more interested in long-term benefits for money they spend. So that purchasing behavior shift has affected the industry a little bit. So yeah, increased reliance on domestic market sales. In other words, we're relying more on our own sales in Canada. If I think back, I was in my greenhouse for 14 years. Over those 14 years, the early years, I was shipping, the very first year I was shipping almost 70% to the US. And by the time I sold my farm, we were 95% Canadian sales. So I'm just a small example, but that sort of fits with the trends. There have been situations with overproduction, and some could say that might be lack of marketing, and that's also again more in the floriculture. Consumers are changing the world is changing how we market to consumers. Like social media is playing a much bigger role, and a lot of farmers have sort of struggled to make the transition to that, to try to reach out to new customers. But I think that they're starting to figure that out now. There's definitely increasing costs all the time. Like, for example, borrowing money or energy costs or labor. We saw a big jump in minimum wage just a few years ago. That had a big impact. Now, farmers get some relief from that, but it's still a big increase in their bottom line. But I'm going to say that the increase in that minimum wage has been fantastic for the average Canadian, especially young people trying to get their lives started. So on the whole, a good thing. And border issues, you're going to see that a couple of times. That's constant. Right now we're fighting with the Americans over aluminum, but in my years with floriculture, I saw 3 major battles with the U.S. Over border. And border disputes happen. It's not because the Americans are bad or something. It's just, arguments happen. You look at your average relationship between two people, you're going to have arguments periodically, and that's what those are. They're always resolved, and life goes on. But they can disrupt things, which is a bit of a pain in the butt. And I'm not going to lie, it's hard to imagine, but the lingering effects of 911. When after 911, procedures at our borders changed dramatically. And I should really have added another dot on here, lingering effects from COVID. Well, actually, it's not lingering, it's we're in the middle of it. That has further complicated the border. But for the most part, the border stayed open, which was really nice to see. So farmers were able, there was a bit of a disruption in the early weeks, but basically things settled down. But 911 really complicated everything with security and pre-screening and the paperwork. Everything got about 4 times more complicated, and it hasn't gone away. Marketing, yeah, big box stores seem to be the predominant market that greenhouses sell through. Uh, One of the problems with big box stores is that the staff there are not paid or motivated to maintain the product at the store. So your shelf life is diminished. Another problem with some big box stores is they incorporate a system called pay by scan, where let's say you shipped every pot that's in this picture, right? And you don't get paid until each pot gets picked up by a consumer and scanned at the cash register. And if in the process of 2 or 3 weeks they all start to die because they're not watered, you may end up losing a lot of money. So pay by scan is a risky venture. That was a Walmart instituted procedure, which companies like Home Depot still use. And interestingly, Walmart has backed away from it because they began to see that the number of companies that were willing to supply them was diminishing because they just couldn't cope with the stress and the risk that was involved. So pay by scan was a real interesting conundrum. Um, when it comes to flowers, there are definitely broad market challenges and changes, and North American consumers typically don't spend as much on flowers as, say, European consumers. Um, with the cut flowers, typically South America and Africa are the biggest competitors. A lot of our roses come from Kenya in Africa. Um, Mexico has massive cut flower farms. Bolivia, Colombia, massive cut flower farms. So typically, what a lot of cut flower growers have done in Ontario and Canada in general is they've switched to cut flowers that don't ship very well. So roses ship very well. Statice ships very well. Snapdragons, not so much. Gerberas, not so much. So farmers have shifted to those crops that are easier to eat, can grow, and are competitive because they can't be compete. They don't have to compete with international farms where labor and environmental and pest control rules are very limited, right? Where we have strict labor requirements, we have limited chemicals for environmental reasons, and those other countries don't have that at all. Uh, so yeah, specialty cuts, Gerber, Snapdragons, and of course, as everyone switches to those, then the price starts to drop and supply and demand kicks in. But there's a lot of Gerbera growers and Snapdragon growers still, and others, lilies. There's lots, um, but definitely varieties have to be carefully chosen in light of competition. This is a picture of the auction in Brampton where most of the potted and cut flowers, not most, but quite a few are shipped to flower shops all over the GTA. They show up here early in the morning, and these days they can log in over the internet and they can watch in real time and book and bid on lots. So each shelf here would be a lot, and they're allowed to pre-inspect the carts in the warehouse, and then when the auction starts, they sit in their chair and they bid, and each cart rolls in. When it's on this green square, that's when bidding is active for that cart, and they can see the price as it drops or as it increases, and then they click on their buy button when they're ready to buy, and it registers. And then when the auction's over, they pick up the carts or the plants and put them in their trucks and go back to their flower shops or vans or minivans, whatever they got. So that's the floral auction. In the past, I've toured there with students, but I think with COVID-19, we're not going to be allowed to do that. Crop protection, pesticides, I did allude to this. Pesticide labels are specific to the country, and not all chemicals that are labeled in the US are allowed to be used in Canada. We do have what's called a minor use program, which allows when there's a real problem, like an outbreak of something, they will temporarily allow farmers to use certain chemicals that otherwise they're not allowed to use. Um, but definitely pesticide use in Canada has become really challenging compared to other countries. And one of the reasons is that it's quite expensive for a company to register a product in Canada. They have to do all sorts of trials and tests to prove that it's safe. And the Canadian market is fairly small, which means there's not a lot of dollar value there. So there's no incentive. Like for example, if a company, a lot of countries will just rubber stamp American policy. So if a chemical is permitted in the United States, then they allow it in their country. But for reasons of whatever, autonomy, the Canadian government makes the company do the entire process again for us. And that means that a lot of effective, safe, biosafe chemicals are not readily available. I will say that the Canadian government has been listening to farmers and trying harder to streamline that process and make it cheaper. So we are starting to see, being a little bit more nimble. But our biggest complaint in the past has been that, say, a chemical comes out in the States and it'll be active in the American market for 3 to 5 years before we get the chemical. And in the 3 to 5 years, they'll have already used it and abused it, and there will be inherent resistance that has worked its way into our market. And then we get a new product, which is kind of marginally effective for a few years, and then it's basically done. So it would be nice to be on the earlier side of that curve for once. Yeah, biosecurity programs, invasive species are an issue. Not only are we trying to protect our country from invasive species, but countries like the United States that we ship to, they don't want invasive species. So, for example, Japanese beetle, which is chomping up all the grapes right now, those would be considered an invasive species. And so there's a Japanese beetle specific program that every greenhouse has to participate in. And there's all sorts of paperwork and inspections and government inspections to make sure that when you ship something, there's no Japanese beetle in it. So there's always some sort of flavor of an invasive species that's, on the horizon. So you just have to be aware and keep on top of the regulations. Biological controls have come a long way, and they are very effective, and I think a lot of growers are still learning how to use them. Canadian growers have always been on the cutting edge, I would say globally. In fact, a lot of beneficial insects were discovered and trialed in Canada and proven in Canada. So we're quite proud of that, and we have a lot of expertise. And I think that the world will benefit, especially when broader companies like the American farmers are quite a few years behind us, but they're catching up quickly, learning how to do biological control. Yeah, border issues, we've already alluded to that. Trump is an example. He's not the only person of what we call protectionist behaviors. And, challenging times, people get their back up, and Canada's guilty of doing the same thing. But border issues is a problem, right? We have to sort of always lobby and stay on top of it to make sure that our markets are still accessible. But yeah, things like security, country of origin can be an issue in Canada. If you bring in cuttings and grow them in your greenhouse and then sell them, there are certain countries that the United States doesn't want to have product from. That can be for various reasons, whether it's political or biological security. When you apply for your export permit in Canada, you have to have country of origin associated with your export label. And you have to make sure that none of those restricted countries are on your export label, or the Americans might reject your shipment at the border. Invasive species, mentioned that. Environment, things like chemicals and runoff, energy, labor. Labor is a big one. It's hard to find labor. That seems really hard to believe, but we saw that with COVID-19. Farmers desperately trying to find people to help maintain their crops. The vegetable sector in Leamington took a really hard hit with COVID-19 because you look at, say you have a 25-hectare greenhouse full of tomatoes. It takes about, I'm going to say six to eight laborers to maintain 1 hectare, and they have to be in the crop every day for harvesting, removing leaves, suckers, twining, lifting or lowering the vines every day. And if they're not there, the tomatoes don't just pause. They keep growing and they become wild and they get out of control and there's a point of no return. And a number of greenhouses had to rip their entire crops out, even though they had weeks or months left of production time still, because they couldn't find the labor to work in the crops because their offshore labor was held up at the border because of COVID restrictions. So labor, domestic labor is a big deal. And from my perspective with our program, the labor that we're related to is growers. And they're having a hard time finding growers. A lot of farms have switched to training their offshore labor to be growers. They hand pick a couple and invest a lot of time and energy into them. And they come back for a number of years, and oftentimes they will apply for citizenship and they'll become permanent residents and then eventually Canadian citizens. And those are, I'm happy for them, but it seems a shame that we have domestic people that are looking for high quality, high paying jobs, and yet no one applies. That it, that's not for everyone, I suppose, but that's something you got to think about. Regulations are something that government changes all the time. One of the things that always bothered me about regulations was that they don't really send out a letter to the farmers to say, hey, we've changed the regulations. What they'll say is it's up to you to check on a regular basis to see if the regulations have changed. Now, no one has the time to do that. So farmers are typically members of farming organizations that will sort of highlight things, and they have people on staff that will watch regulations and alert farmers to potential changes, maybe even before they become the law, so that they can lobby against them if they're particularly problematic. This one, I find this one always humorous, greenhouse gas, but I'm surprised at how many people think that greenhouse gas is something that greenhouses produce. I think more people are beginning to understand that that's not the case, but I kid you not, I still run into that. So that can be a real challenge. People think greenhouses are really bad, dirty, and whatnot. But these are some invasive species that have been issues for Canadian growers. Japanese beetle, sweet midge, chili thrip, sudden oak death, white chrysanthemum rust, Duponchelia, citrus mealybug. It's insane. It just goes on and on and on. It's like Mother Nature's just always trying to throw a curveball. There are other things like CITES is a international agreement where species that are at risk are protected. So certain cyclamen, cacti, and orchids, there's a risk that they may cross-pollinate with stuff that's shipped, domesticated plants. And in order to maintain genetic purity, they're blocked from certain parts of the world. So CITES is something that you have to be very aware of if you're shipping internationally. As far as environment, zero discharge is something that has been coming to Ontario. They're phasing in across the province, and it takes time, but they are doing inspections and keeping pressure on farmers. And that's so that there's no runoff from the farm. And ultimately, that's fantastic. Very difficult to do, but farmers are getting very close to that. There's a few farms that are almost exactly zero runoff, but it's oftentimes they have to do periodic discharge. They apply for a permit, an inspector comes, and then they are allowed to discharge into a sewage system just because they can't cope with it anymore. But there's been huge advancements in this area, and that helps save your bottom line because you're not throwing chemicals away. Everything gets used by the plants. Yeah, environment, some of these things like fungal disease, temperature, some crops are very challenging to grow, but we'll get into that later on. Energy, we are living in a time when energy is remarkably inexpensive. That is for various reasons, geopolitical, virus, recessionary problems, or even oversupply, like Americans drilling lots and lots and lots of gas wells, and there's tons of natural gas, so it's cheap, which is fantastic. But greenhouses are always very energy conscious because they use a lot and that it's a big factor on their bottom line. So they're always looking for ways to save energy. Um, Probably one of the biggest things you'll see in the next few years, quite a few big greenhouses have these. They're called cogen units, which produce electricity, heat, and carbon dioxide, and all three are used by the greenhouse. And oftentimes they produce more electricity than they consume, so they sell it back into the grid for extra dollars. And the province actually contracts that, so it can generate a lot of money for a farm. Labor, talked about that, finding, retaining. Labor represents up to a third of their farm's costs. And obviously, seasonal offshore labor is a big part of it. But automation is the latest craze. Trying to, if we can't have people, we need robots. And looking at Horta Daily publications, almost every month there's another company coming out with a new robot that to help pick cucumbers or to pick cherry tomatoes or to pick strawberries. I think these robots are still very primitive, but we know how technology works, right? It wasn't that long ago that we didn't have cell phones, so don't be surprised if another 10, 20 years there's almost no one in the greenhouse and it's all robot harvested and maintained. Also, in terms of labor, consolidating, so farms merging allows growers to be more efficient. They can shift the labor around to where it's needed and get things done in a hurry. Urban-rural boundaries are also an issue. So here you've got cottages along Lake Erie and greenhouses right beside them. And sometimes you get conflict. Now, it's sort of irrational conflict because these greenhouses would have been there for a very long time and the cottages are relatively new. And the cottagers are kind of finicky people that think that because they've got a cottage that everyone should obey what they want. But transport trucks have to get in and out up these roads. It causes traffic and noise. And so we have boundaries, urban-rural boundaries. In recent years, a lot of that stuff has been addressed, but it's something that farmers have to be aware of. Trying to organize it so that truck or transport traffic is during working hours, not at night, or that trucks don't use their engine brakes to keep noise down, all that sort of thing. And then grow lights at night, that they're not blowing up the person's bedroom with lots of light when they're trying to fall asleep. So they shift their photo period so that light comes on, say at 3 a.m. when everyone's asleep already. That kind of stuff. So why get in the industry? Well, it's still profitable for one. There's money in it, which means there's jobs and there's a good career for you. Vegetable growers, like I said, looking at vegetable sector alone is probably the most promising. Some statistics that 90% of Americans do not eat enough vegetables. If you remember from the Michelle and Barack Obama days, Michelle Obama had a big heart for food for inner city people and urban dwellers and trying to find ways to get healthier food choices to people. It's a known problem in the States. And again, I already told you the American market is massive compared to the Canadian. So here's a really striking statistic that shows you what potential lies in the greenhouse industry for vegetables. If every U.S. customer or consumer increased their vegetable consumption by 10%, the industry, that's all greenhouses, would have to double in size. So yeah, greenhouses are frantically trying to keep up with demand. And that's good news for us, right? That's good news for jobs. That's good news for farmers. And of course, who doesn't like flowers? So working in floriculture is a beautiful environment. So that brings us to an end, introducing floriculture and vegetable greenhouse sector. As you go through this crops course, we're going to grow a bunch of different crops, poinsettias, followed by some hydrangeas, some potted gerberas, assorted things. And then there's also the vegetable crops that we grow in the greenhouse. So I hope you really enjoy the course, and I look forward to seeing you at the greenhouse this term. Take care.